Special thanks to Eli Hutchinson for today's review. And today, he specifically asked me to talk about a more modern Western film. And after seeing the film for myself, we did the deal and now I'm reviewing it. So here we are. The Lone Ranger is a 2013 Western action film directed by Gore Verbinski, who also directed the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies, as well as Rango, also a Western. Upon learning that, I suddenly realized where the style of this film comes from. Aside from the fact that both star Johnny Depp in a major role, the films have this tacky-wacky exaggerated style about them, so learning that they were done by the same director, that explains so much. Yeah, so if I had to describe The Lone Ranger in one sentence, it would be that it's almost like Pirates of the Caribbean in the Wild West. So with that being said, the titular character is based on a fictional Texas Ranger created by Franz Stryker and George Trendle, and he first appeared in a radio series in late January 1933. And as the story goes, the character was popular enough to spawn a franchise, which includes a lot of things. Now, I'm not here to judge the 2013 film as an adaptation, but as far as I know, they are pretty faithful to the traditional source material on the account of how the Lone Ranger even became the Lone Ranger. So anyways, without further ado, let's talk about the Lone Ranger film itself. Having done brief research for this film, the movie itself starts at a fair in San Francisco 1933, the exact year the fictional character was created, and I really like it when fictional stories work with what happened in reality. But that aside, the main way the movie is set up is that it takes place at a time where the Lone Ranger has already been immortalized as a legendary hero. And a boy named Will attending this fair stumbles into an elderly Tonto, who was at first posing as a statue or something. Now this is something I want to say firsthand. Johnny Depp is pretty good at becoming a character, and he never looks the same in any role that he does. He's commonly agreed to look like this, right? But if you look at his portrayal of Willy Wonka, or Tonto, or anything else, they look nothing alike. And I've been told that the man does this intentionally, and it certainly makes him more remarkable as an actor than most, because he's got an incredible range when it comes to characters. I've seen him in a bunch of movies, and he's never the same, unless he's supposed to be playing himself. There was a casting controversy when it was announced that Johnny Depp would be playing the Native American character Tonto. And Johnny Depp personally stated that he believes he has some Native American ancestry from one of his great-grandmothers. And he took on the role to represent Native Americans better than the early days of cinema. Now, I don't know much about Native American culture, because I'm a fucking Australian, duh, but I didn't find anything about Depp's performance as a character not his own ethnicity to be negative or derogatory in any way. It is quite how I imagine your stereotypical Native American to be like though. That being that they're survivalists and respect nature, and that they have certain haircuts, and all that stuff. To me personally, I based what I know of Native Americans off of how fiction portrays them. 2 examples that come to mind is Assassin's Creed 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2. I also imagine them having distinct passive voices, and they don't sound as aggressive as other kinds of people in the world. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before we begin. I'm no expert, so I'm just critiquing what I see on face value. So anyways, the story is told through a framing device in the future, where Tonto talks about his experience with the Lone Ranger. In the first scene with the titular character, he's seen in a flashback along with Tonto riding straight into a town, with the pair strolling right into a bank, to where the Lone Ranger announces that he and Tonto are robbing the damn bank. Although he doesn't say it confidently, since he notes that the bank is insured. When no one takes the pair seriously, Tonto throws his tomahawk at a bystander's top hat, cutting it in half, although obviously without leaving a scratch on the man, and the Lone Ranger shooting down a ceiling light, and mid-dramatic jump, Tonto is interrupted as he's telling the story, with Will asking that the Lone Ranger couldn't have done that because he's a goddamn hero, and heroes don't rob banks. This entire scene is played for comic relief, and it's in line with the sort of humor the film has. Thinking about it, the Lone Ranger really is Pirates of the Caribbean in the Wild West, down to Johnny Depp being a major actor in both, as stated before. So with that being said, this is where we start from the very beginning. In Colby, Texas, 1869, we open with the construction of a railroad track. The guy in charge of this is Latham Cole, who announces that it will connect the entire country to each other. So I presume this is a railway that will transport people from one state to another. Like getting from California to New York is now much easier. Or at least that's the idea. We also get the setup of one of the main villains, as Cole announces that he intends to respect land treaties with the Indians, and proceeds to state that the criminal known as Butch Cavendish, who has been killing Indians, will be transported to where they are now, to hang for his crimes. Along with this, we get another important character, Dan Reid, the man who captured Butch in the first place. They're standing at the train station, ready to await the arrival of Butch. Right off the bat, they allude to a scumbag that has cannibalistic tendencies, but our titular Lone Ranger is introduced as John Reid, Dan's brother, who is on the very train carrying the criminal. We see him reading a book, and when some toddler girl drops her doll, he kindly picks it up and gestures for her to catch, although it gets sucked out the window, and makes the girl very upset. So with that being said, we get introduced to Butch as a guard passes by the train to check up on said prisoner. Butch looks exactly how you'd expect an unkempt, unsanitary criminal to look, but aside him is Tonto, also presumably awaiting punishment. We get the first hint of his character when we see that he's obsessed with a watch that doesn't work. Tonto during this beginning is a very quiet and reserved character, but I suppose he's like that the whole movie, to be fair. We also get introduced to Rebecca Reid, Dan's wife, along with her son. Now with all these characters so far set up, the conflict starts when a group of rugged looking outlaws show up to intercept the train, and you can tell by their cues that they're here to free Butch. Butch himself isn't so helpless, however. He manages to secretly unplug a hidden gun from underneath the floorboard, and after sneaking the gun in his pocket, he says that he needs a piss break. He urinates in a bucket, and Tonto tries signaling the guards silently that Butch has a gun, but by the time he catches the memo, Butch quick shots both guards. This is toppled with the outlaws boarding the train, and the music picks up here. And it's exactly the kind of thing you'd hear in Red Dead Redemption 2. Similar soundtrack in other words. John on the train notices the shadow of a guy up top and goes to investigate. And we see the train driver's neck being snapped by a dude with a chain. This is basic tension building 101 essentially, and as John slowly descends into trouble, and being on the same train as Tonto, you can tell that eventually they're going to meet and form a partnership. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The outlaws are cruel and sadistic as ever. One of them shoots an innocent man in the leg, and another shoots the two train drivers dead, and chains the train up to continue speeding up. Butch meanwhile is about to execute Tonto, all before John busts through the door and distracts Butch, who turns the gun on him, but then Tonto pulls his gun out on Butch and forces him to drop the gun. And it's this back and forth confrontation where before Tonto shoots Butch, John disarms him and says that Butch will be punished properly. Although he spoke too soon, because Butch's outlaw gang open the front door and all pull guns on John, and he's forced to drop the gun. Yeah, so John has to surrender and ends up being the one chained with Tonto. Butch officially escapes, and the train eventually passes by the station in full force. Now Tonto manages to free both himself and John by snapping open the plank holding the chain. Although the problem ends up being the fact that they're both stuck with each other, at least for the time being. Now throughout this movie, John and Tonto are reluctant partners, and express their different approaches on how to solve problems. Tonto intends to jump off, but John stops him by asking him what about the passengers, to which Tonto merely replies that they can jump off too. But obviously this isn't an option with children on board, so they both do a tug of war with their chains, but eventually John gets his way, and the two work together to get to the front of the train and save the day. We get this nice wacky action with John and Tonto getting stuck with their chains, having to avoid falling off the train. This starts with the pair being held at gunpoint, although John grabs onto an incoming hook and soars around the train with Tonto. It's also very snappy, as before they're both shot by one of the outlaws, the criminal's leg is whipped and he's pulled away by law enforcement, more specifically Dan. The three work together to detach the train to save all the civilians on board, and this includes Tonto going under the train to detach it, saving the people on board. But unfortunately, it's the end of the line for the track, as the train obliterates everything, before being caught by a wire and spiraling everything out of control. The pair are thrown off the train as everything causes a wreck, and that's the end of the first action sequence. And I thought it was pretty entertaining. The film sets up John and Tonto's eventual reluctant partnership, and as well as that, sets up all major characters in some way or another. While only briefly seen, another character that will play a role later, Red Harrington, can be seen at the start of the film. And while she doesn't have any dialogue or characterization, she'll play a part in the film later. So with that being said, this is about the first 25 minutes of the film, and you may be surprised to hear that it's been 25 minutes since the film started. And this film has been criticized for a bloated runtime, but I in particular don't find it to be a major weakness of the film. In my opinion, it's just a film that goes on a little too long, rather than something I'd call overly bloated, although I do see where the criticism comes from. So after they save the day, Tonto tries walking away, finding his chains done, but unfortunately for him, he was still arrested for something, and John intends to still turn him in, despite remarking that he'll put a good word in. We get this moment where John grabs onto Tonto's leg, and absolutely refuses to let go, all of which is an embarrassment in front of his brother and his crew, meant to establish that his brother is the top dog, and John is a small fry when it comes to keeping the peace. In the next scene, he directly locks Tonto up, insisting that it's nothing personal, all before Rebecca comes in. Now, it's established that despite Dan and Rebecca being married, John holds feelings for Rebecca, and vice versa. And Dan himself is established as being actually indifferent about it. And this is actually an interesting approach to take a romance subplot. That Rebecca is married to the main character's brother, but the two still like each other, and the brother himself doesn't care all that much. Dan isn't even a terrible husband. He's depicted as being quite fine, albeit busy with his work as a Texas Ranger at the same time. This also comes full circle later, but we'll get to that. So John cares for his sister-in-law more than a platonic relationship. It's established that the two have known each other since they were kids, and they speak like long-lost acquaintances since it's been established as being 8 to 9 years since they last spoke. John remaining a guy who sticks to the city environment. John also meets his nephew for the first time, but it's here he learns that his brother Dan is going out to look for Butch. John volunteers to join his brother and his crew, and both Rebecca and Cole say goodbye to them as they go off. Dan also gives his son a task to do that he hopes he achieves by the time he gets back. Dan tosses John a Texas Ranger badge before they head off, and so they travel across the frontier to find Butch. So after a montage of traveling across the desert, one interaction they have while traveling is Dan telling John a ghost story about a spirit horse as they pass by a white horse. Dan and John act sarcastic around each other, although it's the type where you can tell that they do care for each other. There's also a setup for later, where John speaks to one of Dan's fellow rangers, remarking how he smells like a distillery with all the alcohol he drinks, and after remarking that he's embraced the Western lifestyle, he gives John an ad for Red Harrington's brothel, which will play a factor later. Eventually, after tracking down a campsite that Butch presumably used, they make it to the canyon with a hot trail on the outlaw. Even though nothing bad has happened yet, you can tell based on the shot that once in, there's no way out, and the story is about to shift in a new direction. Now, Dan hands John a revolver, but used to civilization, he tells him that he doesn't believe in guns, but Dan tells him that Butch don't care either way, and it's best to be prepared. Although ultimately, John refuses the revolver, and the group enter the canyon where out in the open, it's eerily quiet, and that builds the anticipation of dread. It's not that direct, but you can feel something in the air as it happens. And then as Dan asks for where one of his rangers are, an ambush happens. One of the rangers gets shot dead, and the rest ensue. And despite their attempts to flee, they all get wiped out, until it's just Dan and John. Although unfortunately, one of the outlaws gets a shot on John's horse, and he finds his legs trapped by the weight of the horse, who collapses right afterwards. While the horse does manage to get up, Dan comes back to offer his hand to John, although he's shot down soon afterwards. And John stays by his side even after it's clear Dan will succumb to his wounds. Now, as I hinted at earlier, Dan states how his wife always loved John, and he wants his brother to take care of his wife, now that he's not gonna make it. And while John tries his hardest to carry Dan with him, he himself is gunned down shortly after and collapses to the ground. Afterwards, Butch and his gang show up, and with the upper hand, Butch taunts the dying Dan, and as the one who captured him to begin with, he decides to completely cut open and cannibalize Dan. And during John's brief state of consciousness, he witnesses Butch partially eat his brother, all before closing his eyes again. After the sadistic Butch has had his meal, he rides off, and it's worth noting that some of his gang underlings can't even stomach his cannibalistic tendencies. Butch really did remind me of Como Driscoll from Red Dead Redemption 2. They're both sadistic outlaws, they look something alike, and they have no redeemable qualities whatsoever. If there was ever a live-action Red Dead Redemption 2. Something funny is that Butch is played by William Fichtner, who voiced Ken Rosenberg in the Grand Theft Auto series, and GTA is made by Rockstar Games, who also did the Red Dead series. Thought it was interesting enough trivia to mention, now that I've made the connection. Anyways, this is where we cut back to Will and Tonto. Will is confused at the fact that Dan did not survive, as he thought Dan was the Lone Ranger. Will is confused at how Tonto explains he showed up later to where the bloodshed happened, having escaped jail in an unspecified way. However, in the following scene, we see Tonto, out of respect, dig graves for all the ambushed men, all before he heads straight to John's grave. Although, as it turns out, he survived, as when Tonto goes to touch him, he grabs onto Tonto's arm, and Tonto initially panics by knocking him out with a rock. However, he goes to dig all their graves, even though John is still alive. But that's when that white horse from earlier shows up, and proceeds to stand above John's soon-to-be grave, dropping a white hat in front of it. Now, Tonto, being who he is confused at this. And his dialogue at the horse suggests that the horse is pointing at John to be a hero of the future. And even when Tonto redirects him to Dan, the horse still insists on John, even wiping the sand off his Texas Ranger badge. And I presume Tonto, being one to listen to the guidance of a sacred animal, decides to carry John across the desert. And after a cheesy horse stump joke, John finds himself awakening days later. Much to his own surprise, he almost falls off to his death, not realizing that he's on top of a wooden platform where one fall would kill him. John's appearance at this rate also tells us that he's completely dingy and dirty. Without his boots, he struggles to walk across the desert after climbing down the platform to where he comes across a campsite. And we also see him gasping down the flask full of water that he finds. All of this adequately presents his rough state after waking up. So anyways, he notices Tonto in front of the white horse and proceeds to pull out his revolver from the campsite and aims it at Tonto. Of course, Tonto notices him and gives him some advice on how to ambush an Indian in particular. And when asked what he's doing with the horse, Tonto establishes that his grandfather taught him about how animals once upon a time could speak, and sometimes they still do when you leave them alone. And he's baffled that the horse chose John as a spirit walker, someone who cannot be killed in battle. And later that night, John recaps what he saw before Tonto showed up, recalling how Butch ate his brother's heart. And Tonto describes Butch in particular as not a man, but an evil spirit, who does not respect nature. And eventually, after a back and forth between the two, John decides he's gonna leave. This is where Tonto reveals to John that there's more going on here. There was a gun waiting for Butch on the train back when the movie began, and that he only found 8 bodies, including his, despite there being 9 of them in the search party, meaning that there must have been a rat who sold them all out. That man being Collins. Collins, for reference, was the guy John spoke to earlier, whom he remarks smelt like a distillery for all the alcohol he consumed. With that being said, Tonto basically gives him the speech that turns him into the Lone Ranger, as John is encouraged to wear a mask made from his brother's vest, which has 2 holes from bullets, which he can now wear as a mask. He gives John the white hat, presumably to symbolize his symbol as a white knight, and they head off to the brothel I mentioned earlier in search of Collins. Now that I think about it, Collins did sort of give John a lead on where he would be next, which is sort of contrived, but on the other hand, he was planning to lead him, alongside the others, into an ambush where they would die. It's just that the plan backfired when it came to John. But still, he was trying to get them killed. The point is that they go to a crazy town full of freaks and weirdos before entering the brothel, announcing that they wish to see Red Harrington, the gal from earlier. They're given entrance inside to see her, and that's where her first and main scene comes into effect. John and Tonto question her on whether she knows Collins, but she plays dumb, and the pair almost get killed when Tonto slams a knife in front of her, although when they mention they're looking for Butch Cavendish, she has a change of heart. And it's even implied that one of her gimmicks, her artificial leg, was the result of Butch removing and eating it. They get the first hints of something larger going on, because apparently the local Indian tribe is being blamed for attacks on frontier settlements, thereby violating a treaty between them and the white settlers. It's actually Butch and his gang disguising themselves as the natives to make them look like they broke the treaty, but the full extent of the motive will be revealed later. This is all before they're chased off by a horde, and the two ride off on the white horse. It's also around this time where Rebecca and Danny get kidnapped by the bad guys. And by the time John and Tonto arrive, they're far past kidnapped. The pair ride into the homestead hours later, and after Tonto closes the eyes of the man who died, they enter the barn house to see one of the lunatic outlaws who's obsessed with women's clothing. So the pair confront him, demanding he tell them where Butch is. The ultimatum being that John will let Tonto, a Native American, do whatever he wants to him, relying on Indian stereotypes, which is unsurprisingly effective. I actually really like that ultimatum, because they're playing into the stereotype that Indians are savages. Don't take that the wrong way, but I imagine this tactic was used often back in the day to intimidate people, back before multiculturalism and acceptance was widespread. But of course, nothing is ever too easy, because other members of Butch's gang show up, and they surround the barn house, with the cross-dresser using this distraction to escape. This is practically the first scene where the Lone Ranger reveals himself to outlaws wearing a mask. Now, despite picking up a revolver next to the body of the guy who was killed, we see that John is still hesitant to fire the weapon. We see this when he pulls out his Texas Ranger badge in front of the outlaws, and they unsurprisingly try to shoot him. He gets out of the way, but before long, what's left of the barn house is lit on fire, and the pair have to find a way out. All the while the outlaws are firing on them. With that being said, John and Tonto are bailed out by the lucky appearance of their white horse, and we get this cool sequence where the three of them ride into the burning barn and circle around, holding two of the outlaws at gunpoint from behind, and this is actually where John fires his first shot. As while the outlaws try to quick shot him, John fires a shot that ricochets off a lot of things before taking down the two outlaws with a wood plank falling on them. Yeah, all in one bullet. The crossdresser flees the scene, and John and Tonto, well, Tonto in particular, decides to slap one of the outlaws' horses, in which the horse will hike to the outlaws, with the pair of them following the horse through the desert. We see Rebecca and Danny after being captured by Butch's gang. Butch is completely unkempt as usual, and taunts Rebecca after she tells him that her husband will be after him for what he's done. And Butch of course reveals that Dan has already been killed, but that's when the crossdresser shows up and reveals that the two other outlaws are dead, killed by one bullet. Butch aggressively gets some answers out of his goon, to where the goon proclaims that Dan must have risen from the dead, and now he's out to kill them all. Hearing this, Rebecca states that Butch better be scared, because Dan survived after all. And this is where Butch resorts to handing a revolver to Collins, the rat from earlier. You can visibly see that he's upset, and we see as he's leading Rebecca and Danny out to be killed, he's completely guilt-stricken over what he's done, and instead decides to fake some shots, and tells them to just go. Now, a minor criticism about this scene is where Butch, despite seeing Collins being upset and quiet, doesn't see that he's feeling guilty. It might have worked a bit better if Colin was merely hiding his emotions, and then when Butch gives him the task of executing both Rebecca and Danny, he reveals his true self in front of them, and then lets them off. Point is, the pair run off, although they don't get far, as an unknown man riding a horse arrives in front of them, shooting Collins dead. And the way the film is shot, we can't see them with the blurry lighting, where we can't make out a face. Cut back to John and Tonto following the horse across the desert, although eventually the horse in front of them stops and drops dead.
And it's gone.
John is completely annoyed at the fact that he trusted Tonto's idea of following the horse, because now that it's dead, they're stuck in the middle of the desert, and God knows if they'll find civilization ever again. As stated before, the two are reluctant partners, and when Tonto confirms the horse is dead, John sarcastically looks down at the dead horse and asks him if he can point them in the right direction, before he yells in Tonto's face, annoyed as all hell. He goes on an explosive rant that Butch is wherever doing God knows what to Rebecca and Danny, and that he's gonna die here with Tonto and the stupid bird on his head. This is where Tonto speaks about Rebecca, and the whole thing about how John has feelings for her. John of course rejects the notion, because obviously she's his brother's wife, now his widowed wife. And some more arguing later, Tonto decides to dig through the sand and finds the impossible. Train tracks hidden in the sand. John is perplexed because they're in Indian territory. How can there be train tracks? However, they don't have long to think about it, because John in particular is attacked with an arrow on his side before collapsing, to where he and Tonto are presumably captured by the tribe. Now in the next scene, we see the consequences of the whole Indians attack the settlers subplot, as Latham Cole announces that due to the Indians attacking the settlers, thus violating the treaty they had, they will be preparing for war, and as well as that, will be building the railroad track ahead of schedule. Now despite Disney being unironically known for twist villains, I pretty much suspected that Cole would be a secret bad guy, given this dialogue. I mean, it's convenient that the supposed actions of the Indians are giving him an edge to get what he wants accomplished, so in terms of the narrative, he's not really a twist villain at all, but still, I suppose the film doesn't treat you like an idiot whatsoever. So we cut to later that night, where both John and Tonto are locked up in a wooden cage. The Comanche tribe are dancing around, and when John asks, Tonto says that they're doing a little dance to prepare for war with the white men. All before we get some comic relief where Tonto pulls the arrow out of John's side, causing him to yell in pain. And then he finds out soon after that he's going to be stitched up from his injury, with Tonto remarking that it's sterile because he previously pissed on it. There's a bit of a sequence where we cut back to Will and Tonto, where Will points out that the Comanche didn't attack the settlers, and that the pair of them did tell them that, right? This is the setup for the next scene where John is thrown into a tent with leaders of the tribe. John at first tries to tell them how he knows they didn't attack the settlements, and if they let him go, he can prove it. Those surrounding him are dead silent, so he awkwardly presumes the tribe doesn't speak English, so instead he tries to use sign language to try and communicate what he's trying to say, and they proceed to laugh at him because he's wearing a mask. All before they show that actually, they can speak English as much as the white man can. John learns through the following exchange that Tonto is no longer a member of the tribe. The reason why traces back to decades ago, when a young Tonto as a boy discovered two white men almost dead, one of them being Butch, and brought them back to his tribe to recover. Despite the hospitality the tribe showed the two men, the men repaid their kindness by convincing the young Tonto to show them where they kept their silver when they discovered it in the nearby water in exchange for a cheap pocket watch. That's where Tonto showed them everything, and in response, they massacred the entire village in order to return to the place later to take all the silver, leaving Tonto as the sole survivor, leading to his mind being twisted by the trauma of losing everything, and the fact that he exchanged everything in exchange for a pocket watch. That's where he found the dead bird, and convinced himself of everything he told John earlier in the film, that the two men were Wendigos. So in actuality, Tonto is delusional, and filled with guilt, and this was an interesting twist. The fact that Tonto was delusional the whole time, and had to cope with the guilt of saving two men who exploited his village's hospitality by wiping them out due to greed. It actually makes sense how far Tonto defended his delusions, such as the part where Tonto says that John as a spirit walker couldn't be killed, when he questions the fact that he was shot by an arrow. Despite this, John offers to keep his brother's deal to the tribe, although they reject his offer, and a quick shot later, we see both John and Tonto buried in the sand, left to die presumably from dehydration. After a futile last attempt to convince the tribe leader otherwise, he's ignored, and the Comanche ride off to flee the US Army. At first, John thinks the US Army can help them out of the sand, but the whole platoon rides past them, not noticing them once. To make matters worse, some scorpions come out of the ground and crawl on the both of them, before the horse shows up and John is able to bite on some of the equipment on the horse, holding on to where he's able to free himself from the sand. There's this brief moment where it seems like he's gonna ditch Tonto, but of course he ends up riding back, because he knows where the river full of silver is. This is where we find Butch working on the railway, forcing some Chinese workers to build it. A group of them protest their working conditions, but Butch just shoots the one in the middle, forcing them to go back to work, unless they want to get shot too. Now this is probably an example of the villain kills his own men cliche that works, because these Chinese workers are probably paid squat, and Butch can probably find 10 more men to take the place of the guy he just killed, so he doesn't end up losing anything. This sort of intimidation works, and it's in line with his character. The crossdresser tries suggesting they just take all the silver they can carry and leave, remarking that they're rich after all, and as punishment for making such a suggestion, presumably because he waited 20 years for this plan to come into fruition, Butch forces his goon to go inside the dark tunnel and investigate, where he's promptly ambushed by John and Tonto. Butch sends in 2 more of his guys to investigate, and they too are whacked by the pair. And I like this part in particular. They send a minecart out with dynamite sizzling down, and Butch and his remaining goons make the mistake of going too close, to where after realizing it's gonna blow, Butch is the only one who gets out of the way, and in comes John and Tonto in a dramatic fashion, with appropriate music to boot. Make this a still frame, and it's the iconic duo walking in with all their glory. John tries beating the whereabouts of Rebecca and Danny out of Butch, whacking him with his revolver, although despite everything that's happened, John refuses to kill him, remarking that it isn't justice. And despite Tonto's remarks that he literally ate his brother's organs, John still refuses to kill him, and so Tonto wants to do it himself if John won't. And that's where John rips on Tonto from what he learned about him. He unintentionally sold out his village for a cheap pocket watch and couldn't live with himself. So he made up everything like the Wendigos and the Spirit Walkers, and John takes off the mask and says that he's done being part of his delusional charade. He also knocks out Tonto before he can execute Butch, and takes Butch himself across the desert to face justice. We see meanwhile that Rebecca and Danny were found by Cole and rescued, as she awakens in a train on the railway. Now, despite calling it a while ago, Cole does act all nice to Danny, which is all part of his motivation to steal Dan's family and make them his own. Cole expresses how he sees himself as a man with a vision, which is how he personally justifies his villainy. Eventually, John, who is carrying Butch across the land, arrives at their location, proceeding to turn Butch into the authorities. Now this is where the whole twist villain thing comes out. Cole forces Rebecca and Danny into one of the back trains, all the while he speaks to John after he's captured Butch. To the film's credit, they do sell the scene as suspenseful, and you can feel it as Cole reveals that he and Butch are in fact brothers, and they're working together to incite a war with the Indians, so he can commit genocide on them all, and build the railroad for profit and take all the silver. This all leads to a confrontation between all the characters, as Rebecca trying to escape is caught by Butch Cavendish, and all the characters are on that classic standoff. This also has Captain J. Fuller, the guy tasked with taking out all the Indians coming in, and while not intentionally complicit in Butch and Cole's crimes, despite John insisting him to make the right choice, he's strong-armed into siding with Cole and Butch. Given he's already unintentionally committed a war crime by attacking innocent natives, and being the coward that he is unwilling to accept the consequences, so he sides with the bad guys. Come to think of it, his appearance reminds me of the incompetent General George Custer, infamous for being a useless war criminal during the American Civil War and the American Indian Wars. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was the direct inspiration for the character. I should also mention that this is around the time the knocked out Tonto wakes up, and will presumably meet up with John and the other characters shortly. being on the railroad. Anyways, being forced to surrender, John is carried out to a firing squad, while Rebecca and Danny are forced to watch. Rebecca does try to dissuade Cole from executing John, but she's completely ignored, and Cole, being ruthless as he is, mentions the Battle of Gettysburg, and how 12,000 men died before lunch, and that nothing is done without sacrifice. I like Rebecca's response, which is spitting on him, to which he slaps her, and Danny tries to intervene but he's slapped away as well. Even harder since he's a minor. The whole scene is set up where the American army plays some music before the execution is underway, and it's pretty much a race against the clock, as we see Tonto dresses himself as a Chinese worker nearby. Thanks to Tonto, John narrowly survives the gunshots for the train cart getting in the way of the firing squad. Before long, there's an ominous noise in the distance, and that's where the Comanche start attacking the army. There's this small part where Butch uses one of the soldiers as a meat shield to protect himself, which is sort of the anti-villain kills his own men cliche, since he resorted to selfish means to protect himself. Tonto moves John on a minecart while he's still blindfolded, and the action sequence is actually one of my favorites in the movie. It's pure chaos, with countless factors. The Indian ambush, the army's retaliation, John and Tonto escaping into the tunnel, Butch trying to catch them, and so much more. The violence between the army and the Indians are actually pretty unhinged, as a matter of fact. The guy who plays Captain Fuller actually has this intense performance where he positions his men to fire at the Indians, and you can even see him spit out his dialogue to fire at will. John and Tonto coordinate their escape, jumping to the right, and in the time Tonto unties John, Butch throws some explosives in with them, remarking how they have a hard time staying dead, and the pair are forced to run out of the tunnel in a fashion similar to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's wacky, fun action, and I'm all for it. So with that being said, this is the maximum low point for the movie, as Tonto recovers his dead bird, and John confesses to him that he was right. There is no justice. Cole controls everything. And the thing is, if Cole represents the law, then he'd rather be an outlaw. And Tonto gives him back the mask, this time being something John will adopt for good. There is some minorly awkward comic relief, with the horse conveniently showing up in a silly manner, but it's hardly a detriment towards the film. In all honesty, the film gets better and more enjoyable the more we reach the end. I suppose it is one of those films that might start off a tad rough, but as the story goes on, it picks up big time. And that was my honest to God experience watching this for the first time before I started the review. So anyways, we cut presumably to the next day, where the railroad company is announcing the construction of the railroad, with special thanks to Cole for making it possible. All the meanwhile, John are rigging explosives like dynamite in order to blow it up. Will, who is hearing the story, points out that Tonto forgot to mention the part where they got the explosives. Except the part at the start where they were robbing the bank was the part they got the explosives. Although the explosives unfortunately short out, so they've got to resort to plan B. Anyways, Cole brings the board of directors in for a little meeting, and announces that he's going to take over the company with majority shares, and tells them to just deal with it, and even rejects a watch he was given in a previous scene as thanks. The irony being that he bribed Tonto with a similar watch. And yeah, they made this guy so uncaring and ruthless that you made me feel bad for these other corporate businessmen who are unfairly getting usurped. He actually ends up shooting his boss in cold blood and forcing the other guys to nominate him as chairman. Thanks to a distraction by Red, remember her, Tonto is able to take the train over and get it moving away. Cole realizes that they're stealing his train, and Red, who is distracting Captain Fuller, does one of her leg shots to destroy some of the army's artillery. Cole orders his men to fire on the train, despite Danny still being inside, to where John Reid directs the Gatling gun to the soldiers cornering Tonto, and the whole thing devolves into a train chase, with John chasing after the trains taking off. Cole also proves that he's not above getting rid of Rebecca, as he slaps her off when she tries to halt his gunfire, to the point where she nearly falls off the train to her death. The climax here is pretty fast-paced, and very alike the tone of the action the film set so far. There's a part where John rides his horse forward before the both of them smack dab into a rock surface, and Captain Fuller attempting to shoot Tonto up above, and Tonto having to dodge all the shots through a half dance. The action on both trains intersect, as Fuller's attention, for example, goes from Tonto to Danny to John in less than a minute. And this is where so much glass breaks, it's not even funny. Tonto uses a ladder to get to the next train, and to be honest, I'm honestly impressed at how creative they got with all this. Obviously they needed a high budget to pull stuff like this off, but at least I can say the money that went into this movie was well spent. John manages to save Rebecca by letting Butch drop her, where she's caught by the horse, and eventually, both Butch and Fuller meet their demise when the carts full of silver and a back train collide, and John is able to whip to safety like Indiana Jones. Tonto, who jumped onto the silver carts, is about to be gunned down by Cole, although John catches a bullet Danny acquired from Tonto earlier in exchange for some fruit in his mouth, and with that one lucky bullet, he fires one lucky shot, disarming Cole, John chanting that he's a spirit walker and he can't miss. Tonto comes to the revelation that Cole isn't even a Wendigo, he's just a greedy white man. And so after handing him back the cheap watch he traded the silver for all those years ago, he disconnects the train, leading to the bridge. Will questions how they let him get away, although as Tonto reveals, turns out the explosives on the bridge didn't short out after all, which yeah, that small twist actually got me, as Cole's well-deserved demise comes into effect, resulting in him drowning due to the weight of the silver, and not an ounce of remorse is felt for the guy. It's obviously poetic, drowning from all the silver he sought. And it's revealed in the next scene that the railroad company, and everyone after the fact, after they save the day, has he and Tonto hailed as heroes, referring to him as the Lone Ranger, bringing the movie full circle. He's thanked for his heroism, but he refuses to take off the mask, as now he's adopted the persona. He then rides over to Rebecca and Danny, wishes them goodbye, and then he rides off into the desert, and alongside Tonto, the two become outlaws. Heroic outlaws, but outlaws nonetheless. I noticed a similarity here with Pirates of the Caribbean, where Will Turner remarks how his father was a pirate, but a good man. And that's the end of the story session. By the time Tonto finishes telling his story in 1933, the lights shut off, and Will questions the whole story he's just been told, asking if it really happened. But Tonto merely responds that it's really up to him, before he throws Will a bullet, I guess to keep as a souvenir, and he vanishes when Will looks away. So with that being said, we get a final sequence where John and Tonto ride off across the desert, and Tonto in the 1930s can be seen walking, which if I had to guess, is meant to symbolize him leaving the 1930s and returning to his glory days. But it's completely subjective, and that's the Lone Ranger. So to be honest, I had a relatively good time watching this film. I'd say it's no masterpiece, but I thought it was a pretty solid film. Although looking at what other people thought of this movie, critics lambasted it for being boring, bloated, and bland. Which, I mean, I can kinda understand the bloated part, given this film is rather long, and things do take time to happen, but beyond that, I noticed that the reviews are actually half and half when it comes to the audience score. Half of people agree with the critics, and half of people think the film is actually far more remarkable than it gets credit for, and is pretty entertaining. You can see that I lean towards the good film side of the argument. Now, looking as the film as an adaptation of an iconic Wild West character, as far as I can tell, it doesn't butcher the source material. Apparently they were going into this film hoping to make a franchise out of it, and those plans were cancelled when this film became a box office bomb. But I think the film is sufficient enough as a one-off thing. Given this was released by Disney in 2013, I imagine Bob Iger would have corporatized any potential franchise just like he did to Star Wars and Marvel. And considering the Lone Ranger is an enduring classic hero character, I certainly wouldn't want them to see them turn the Lone Ranger into Jake Skywalker, or insert a shitload of politics into it. That's not really reflective of the source material, since he was made in the 1930s after all. So with that being said, that's my thoughts on 2013's The Lone Ranger. I don't really see anything objectively wrong with this film that drags it down too much. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain, praying that the law is right. But oh, your city, life